and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's talk by Veronica Cedillos, the second in our MIT Architecture Fall 2020 lecture series. Before we proceed with our program, on behalf of MIT and the Department of Architecture, I would like to start with the following acknowledgement. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land, and we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. It is an honor to introduce today's speaker, Veronica Cedillos, who is President and CEO at GeoHazards International, a nonprofit organization focused on empowering communities to be safer in the face of disasters. She is responsible for the strategic and financial management of the organization, including that of field offices in Haiti, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Dominican Republic. Veronica's educational background is in structural engineering. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from here at MIT, and a Master's of Science in Structural Engineering from Stanford University. She's a licensed civil engineer in California. Her professional experience has focused on managing projects to reduce the impacts of natural hazards. She has directed numerous efforts focusing on seismic and tsunami risk reduction throughout the world, including major projects in Armenia, Haiti, Indonesia, Kyrgyz Republic, Peru, and the United States. As part of this work, she's lived in Haiti, Indonesia, and Peru for extended periods. In recognition of her work, Veronica was selected as the 2010 American Society of Civil Engineers New Faces of Engineering Award, and was awarded the 2011 Shaw Family Innovation Prize by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, EERI. She was named an EERI Hausner Fellow in 2017 and serves on the executive committee of EERI's School Earthquake Safety Initiative. She has been a major contributor or editor on several technical reports that guide practicing engineers to design buildings to withstand natural hazards. We invited Veronica here to share her work with us today because we are inspired by her commitment, innovation, and leadership in design and engineering for underserved communities, as her lecture's title describes. Resilience in the face of increasing disasters and anthropogenic climate change is an urgent worldwide concern and interrelates with pressing questions of environmental justice and equity. We look forward to learning more about the important work that Veronica and GeoHazards International are embarking on in this evening's talk. It is also my pleasure to introduce Daniele Stabek Rodriguez, who will join me in a panel discussion with Veronica after her lecture. Daniele is a Puerto Rican designer and architect in training. She obtained her bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Puerto Rico and her Master of Architecture degree from here at MIT, where she also served as a teaching fellow. She is currently a design critic at the Rhode Island School of Design and the University of Illinois School of Architecture at Urbana-Champaign. Daniele has been involved in various design build research projects, including a self-assembling shelter, a housing initiative in Rwanda, and post-hurricane reconstruction in Puerto Rico. Her research explores new possibilities in which spaces of production can act as condensers of creativity and culture, both despite and by virtue of the rise of new technologies, and what the implications of these technologies can be for architecture. Daniele is actively collaborating with different organizations on the resilient reconstruction of Puerto Rico, starting with workshops that she led after Hurricane Maria, and more recently after earthquakes in the south of Puerto Rico. She's been working with collaborators to promote safer construction practices and COVID-adapted shelters. Welcome back, Daniele. Really nice to have you here. So the structure for this evening's lecture will start with Veronica's talk, followed by the panel discussion, in which we will also welcome questions from the audience. So please post questions that you have during the lecture or afterwards in the webcast portal or on Facebook. And the questions will be compiled by our lecture team, including by our student Eduardo Gascon Alvarez, and communicated to me to share with our speakers. With that, thank you all again for joining. Please join me in welcoming Veronica Cedillos.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, for the very generous and kind introduction. I am so honored to be a speaker this evening. And many thanks to the department and in particular the Building Technology Group for inviting me. As I was preparing this talk, I started reflecting a lot on my formative experience at MIT and what it taught me and how it has played an influence in where I am today. And two things in particular came to mind. And one is that MIT really instilled in me that no problem is too complex or too challenging to tackle. It was there that I really started to push the boundaries of my own capacities and realize that a lot of my limitations are self-imposed. Second was, I don't know if it was the ethics and science class that I took while I was at MIT, but it was during those years that I started thinking deeply about what impact my work in the future was going to have and how I wanted to dedicate my life. It was then that I started getting this drive to want to work on pressing issues around the world, not just of today, but also of the future. Those seeds that were planted many years ago while I was at MIT still influence the decisions, career choices that I make today. And it's one of the reasons that I'm here today to tell you about the great work that the nonprofit GeoHazards International has been doing. So I'm very pleased to be presenting all the work of the organization as the president and CEO. I will now share my screen. 1 second. See? And I'm hoping that everyone can see my presentation now. So the topic of my presentation is designing for disasters before they happen, with a focus on underserved communities. I'm going to start off by telling you why our organization exists and what our focus is. Then I'll give you specific examples of our past or ongoing programs. This will include a program on school retrofits in Nepal, scenario and risk-informed planning in India, earthquake desks in Bhutan, and then I'll give you some brief information about some concepts that are under development that I thought this group might find particularly interesting. And I'll wrap it up with key takeaways. So the graph you see on the left compares fatalities from natural disasters in high and upper middle income countries versus low and lower middle income countries. In orange, you see number of deaths per disaster event, and in green, you see the rate of deaths per 100,000 people. And what we see is a stark difference in deaths between the two income categories. In fact, when we look at total disaster deaths, we find that over 90% of disaster fatalities occur in developing countries. And it's not just immediate impacts. In fact, 26 million people are thrust into poverty each year because of natural disasters. And this is because in disasters, poor people lose more share of their assets and wealth than people who have more resources. So someone losing $100 is really what consequences that has on a person's life is very different if you're very wealthy versus if you're in extreme poverty. Education and future can be derailed. So destroyed school buildings don't just mean that they put kids' life at risk who are in the school building, but it also means that many will not be able to return to class if the schools are not usable. And for many, they never return to school. Many may lose access to jobs and opportunities due to infrastructure being damaged or roads no longer being accessible. And we also see increased health risks due to maybe the only accessible health clinic being damaged or the water supply being compromised. So what we see overall is that natural disasters exacerbate inequalities. And we are living and seeing this now with the pandemic, as poor and minority communities are suffering disproportionate deaths and impacts. So this is not unique. We see this disproportionate impacts disaster after disaster. But this is not inevitable. This quote speaks to this. Exposure to disaster is exacerbated by poverty, lack of early warning systems, poor governance, and an absence of the civil protection mechanisms that are taken for granted in high-income countries. And this is why our organization's focus is on disaster prevention. We take on disasters before they happen to save lives and protect communities. We focus on measures that we know work, like planning and development with risk in mind, designing and constructing disaster-resistant structures such as buildings, bridges, water infrastructure. We ensure that key infrastructure can function during a disaster. And this goes beyond just the structural safety, let's say, of a hospital. Let's say a hospital building might survive an earthquake, but if all of its contents inside are damaged, it can't be used to help serve the community when it's needed most. And a last example is preparedness information that is informed by the latest science. So there has long been international consensus that proactive measures are the most effective way in saving lives and protecting livelihoods. And this has been highlighted at every single UN World Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction since the mid-90s. But given this information, you may be surprised to hear that less than 4% of all worldwide aid for natural disasters goes to preventative measures that keep people safe in the first place. The vast majority of funding goes to reactive measures after people have experienced irrecoverable loss. This is one of the biggest challenges in our work, is the lack of funding and attention that is given to disaster prevention measures. So we were created to help address these gaps. GHI, GeoHazards International, is a nonprofit founded in 1991 with headquarters in California, with the mission to end preventable death and suffering from natural disasters in the world's most vulnerable community. Our approach focuses on proactive and preventative measures. We apply the latest science and engineering. We aim to be a catalyst for long-lasting impact, and you will hear a lot of this in some of the examples I will give. And we focus on strong local engagement and presence. Since our founding, we have worked in over 20 countries, and our focus has been on earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, and more recently, climate-induced hazards. We currently have offices in 6 different countries, including headquarters. So we have Haiti, Dominican Republic, India, Nepal, and Bhutan. We mostly have international staff, and the people overseeing all the work on the ground in the respective regions and countries are the people you see here. So before we dive into any particular examples, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on natural hazard risk. Natural hazard risk is a function of hazard, of exposure, and vulnerability. Hazard being a potentially destructive event, like an earthquake, a flood, a tropical storm. Exposure meaning the people or built environment that are exposed to a given hazard. So if you have a tornado where no one is located, that is not a high risk. Vulnerability meaning vulnerability of the built environment or society itself. And as you will see in the rest of my talk, natural hazard risk is rapidly increasing. On the hazard side, we see an increase in new and exacerbated hazards due to climate change, as well as an increase in cascading and concurrent hazards. On the exposure side, we see an increase in population and built environment in areas exposed to very high hazards. And on the vulnerability side, we see rapid development happening without a consideration for hazards. So let's first go to South Asia, which includes the following 3 countries where we work. That's India, Nepal, and Bhutan. And we'll focus along the Himalayan region, which goes through all of Nepal, all of Bhutan, and a lot of Northeast India here and here as well. So here you have a map of the Himalayan region and showing the year of great Himalayan earthquakes. So here you have India, here you have China, and behind these ovals is Nepal and Bhutan. And when I say great, I mean a magnitude 8 or higher. And to give you an idea of what that means, for those of you that might not be as familiar with magnitude, is a magnitude earthquake releases approximately the equivalent energy of the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. The size of the ovals you see here are approximately the size of the earthquake. So the larger the oval, the larger the earthquake. And the light pink line that you see going across the map with the small arrowheads, this shows the interface of 2 plates colliding into each other, which causes these great earthquakes. The collision between these 2 plates has been occurring for over 50 million years, and it's the reason why the Himalayan mountain range exists and why it continues to grow. Now, in terms of population, if we look at the population in the Himalayas along various regions over the last 100 years, we see a marked increase over the last 50 years. In fact, we see an over 250% increase in the population from 1961 to 2011. And when we look at the annual growth, this is 3 times the world average. So let's look at an example of what this looks like on the ground. This is a photo of Musika municipality. This is in Nepal along the Himalayas. And as you can see, there's a lot of green space. And keep your eyes on these 2 yellow circles because these will be used for reference for the subsequent photos. So here's Musicat 8 years later. And here it is again 6 years later. So you can see Very fast growth, a lot more multi-story buildings, a lot less green space. So just to give you a sense of what happened over those 14 years, this is Musika back in 2004, and here it is in 2018. And this is an area of very high earthquake hazard, as I mentioned before, so building safely is very important. And this population growth has also driven an increase in informal road construction, which is destabilizing slopes, which can trigger landslides. And these are only further exacerbated by more extreme rainfall that we're seeing with climate change. And when we look at the type of construction being used for this growing population, we see heavy and brittle unengineered construction. In this particular example, we see weak ties between elements, so that in earthquake shaking, walls and columns can easily pull away from floors and roofs, causing catastrophic failure. We also see incremental construction with additional floors added many years later without consideration of the capacities of the lower floors. And we see construction in areas that are particularly hazardous, as you can see here, with construction happening on steep, unstable slopes. Now, we also see vulnerability of the infrastructure itself. This is just one particular example. So here we're again in far west Nepal. In yellow, you see the one highway that serves over 700,000 people in 4 districts. And this one highway crosses a fault here with you can see the fault in the red line. So what this means is that in an earthquake, which can generate a lot of simultaneous landslides and damage bridges, these areas are likely to be completely isolated. So it's very important that their critical infrastructure like hospitals and water supply systems are able to function and serve the community during a disaster. So let's get to our first example of a past program. So this first example is a past program that took place many years ago. This is a school retrofits in Nepal. It was one of our very first programs. This was in Kathmandu Valley, Nepal. So this program started in the mid-90s, and GHI, along with local partners, started a project to evaluate the earthquake risk in Kathmandu Valley and created an action plan to address the earthquake risk. One of the main highlights or focus areas of this program was to address vulnerable schools. So as part of this, masons were trained to retrofit schools. We worked in close collaboration with a local NGO, NSET, that's the National Society for Earthquake Technology, which became the leading local organization to conduct school retrofits in the region and was one of the main groups implementing the action plan that was developed into this program. So fast forward 20 years and the Nepal magnitude 7.8 earthquake strikes. The area where this program had taken place was part of the affected area. And what we saw on the ground was that school buildings that had been retrofitted following this program performed much better than those that had not been reinforced. And here's just one very dramatic example. What you're seeing here is an example of 2 school buildings standing side by side. Well, one's not standing, after the magnitude 7.8 2015 earthquake in Nepal. On the left, you see just the remnants of a 6-classroom school building that collapsed due to the earthquake. And on the right, you see the reinforced building that stood strong. So I want to share a video so you could hear more about this program and the impact of this program from the trained masons themselves in the village where we worked.
जुन चाहिँ हामीले होनी सुई ढ्याले बनाएको रेट्रोफिट बनेको घर कतै चर्क्यापिङ छैन के भएको छैन अरू चर्किनु लड्नु
Nongkhel is a close-knit community. Many of the locals are masons or farmers. In 1997, GeoHazards International and local partner NSET introduced methods to strengthen weak buildings by retrofitting the village school. Balkrishna Kasula, who attended this school as a child, was head mason during the retrofit.
प्रेम टक्करको संस्था जियोहाजर्ड इन्टरनेसनल र एनसेटबाट स्कुल छान्ने काम भएको रहेछ। त्यो मध्येमा यही श्री भुवनेश्वरी स्कुललाई पनि छनौट गरेर उनीहरू आएर कम्युनिटीसँग हामीले यस्तो गर्न लागेको छौँ, यो स्कुललाई यस्तो रेट्रोफिट भन्ने नेपालमा पहिलो कहिले नगरेको पहिलोचोटि रेट्रोफिट चाहिँ यो स्कुलमा गरेर तपाईहरुलाई काम पनि सिकाउँछौँ, प्रविधि पनि सिकाउँछौँ भनेर आउनुभयो।
Back in the days, Tulsidas Kasula went to school here too.
मेरो त अब छोराहरू भयो, म आफै पढिराखेको, म आफैले पनि काम गरेको, छोराहरू पनि हिँडिरहेका छन्, मेरो अहिले नातिहरू छन्, नाति पनि हिँडिरहेका छन्, अन्त पढाएको छैन।
Soon after the retrofit, GeoHazards International and NSET held a community event before the school reopened. The purpose was to explain to the community why safer building practices are needed. A shake table demonstration caught everyone's attention.
रेट्रोफिट सँगसँगै चाहिँ हामीले त्यो मोडल पनि बनायो, उहाँले बनाउनु ल्याउनु भयो, अर्कै बाहिरको मान्छेले आएर बनाउनु भयो। त्यो बनाएको देखेर हामीले यता स्कुलतिर काम गर्छ, उता अर्को मोडल बन्दैछ। त्यो के बनाएको हो, किन यो त इन्टा पनि सानो सानो मसिनो थियो, बन्दै जाँदा चाहिँ स्कुलकै नमुनाबाट स्कुलकै डिजाइनबाट बन्यो। समापनको दिनमा चाहिँ एउटै टेबलमा दुईटा राखेर भूकम्प आएको जस्तै हलाएर देखाउनु भयो। हलाउँदै चाहिँ सुरुमा अलिअलि चर्किँदै भूकम्प प्रतिरोधी अपनाएर बनाएको चाहिँ के पनि भएन, चर्किँदा पनि सर्केन। जुन कच्ची पुरानो सिस्टमबाट बनेको चाहिँ घर चाहिँ त्यो पुरै भड्कियो।
त्यो सेक टेबल गर्दाखेरि त बाहिरको कम्युनिटीहरू पनि आउँछन्। भड्कियो, यो किन भड्किन भनेर कोट्याएर हेर्ने, हामीले त्यसलाई यो प्रविधि अपनाएको लडेन, यो प्रविधि नअपनाएको चाहिँ लड्यो।
Tulsidas went on to build a safer house for his family.
आफ्नो घर बनाउँदा पनि केही मात्रामा भने हामीले भूकम्प प्रतिरोधी अपनाएर घर बनाउनु पर्ने हिसाबमा हामीले बनाएको हो। अब हामीले स्कुलबाट सिक्दै गइसकेपछि पनि हामीले जहाँ काम गर्छौँ त्यही भूकम्प प्रतिरोधी नै घर बनाइरहेका छौँ।
यहाँको हामी सहकर्मीहरू अलि काममा अलि मेहनतका साथ लागे र सिके पनि यो प्रविधि धेरै सूचना मार्फत पनि फैलियो। अरू मान्छेले पनि अब फलाना तालिम लिएको मान्छेलाई नै घर बनाउँछु भनेर घरमासम्म बोलाएर आउने गर्यो। अहिले यहाँको कम्युनिटीले घर बनाउँदाखेरि सबैको भूकम्प प्रतिरोधी नै बनाइरहेछन्। यो सिके लगत्तै फेरि एनसेट र यो जियोहाजर्ड इन्टरनेसनल हामी अरू स्कुलमा पनि गर्छौँ। यो स्कुलमा गर्दाखेरि तपाईहरुलाई इन्जिनियरले जसरी सिकायो तपाईहरु यो प्रविधिलाई त्यहाँ अरू ठाउँको डोकरीमेहरुलाई पनि त्यसरी नै सिकाएर स्कुल बनाउँछौँ। एउटा
Meanwhile, the school is safe and the children continue learning.
स्कुलमा झन्झनै 140 ना विद्यार्थीहरू अध्ययनरत छन्। यतै लोकलकै स्थानीय अभिभावकहरूले हुनु। हाम्रो दुवै भवन भूकम्प प्रतिरोधी भएको कारणले गर्दाखेरि भूकम्पको बेलामा पनि हाम्रो स्कुल भत्केर हामी चोटग्रस्त होला भन्ने विद्यार्थीहरूमा मानसिक तनाव देखिँदैन।
So following this program, and before the 2015 earthquake, approximately 300 schools were retrofitted. The vast majority of these schools were in areas that were affected by the earthquake, and all of them survived. This is in contrast to the thousands of unretrofitted vulnerable schools that were severely damaged or collapsed. To me, one of the reasons I wanted to show this, feature this example is because it really shows that preventative measures can really take a long time to show their benefit. And I think this is a very important lesson from this. And in this particular case, took 20 years. So let's move on to the next example of, this is of an ongoing program. And this program started in 2013 in the city of Aizawl in the state of Mizoram in far northeast India, as you see on the map. And this is a program focused on scenario and risk-informed planning. So traditionally, most people of Mizoram state lived on tops of ridges and timber homes like these, and slopes were mostly undisturbed. Earthquakes could do very little harm as the building materials were light and flexible, so you could imagine even if this building were to collapse, it would maybe injure someone at most. But things have changed over the years. Here's Aizawl today. Aizawl is a rapidly growing city of 300,000, whose population is projected to more than double by 2030. The city sits along steep, unstable slopes. And the slopes are particularly vulnerable to landslides because the bedding planes are parallel to the slope as opposed to perpendicular, which is more stable. The rock is mostly shale and sandstone, which is weak in strength and is very prone to sliding. Unengineered construction is destabilizing these slopes, which is only worsened by extreme rainfall due to climate change. The city is now plagued by frequent deadly landslides. The dirt area you see here in the top middle half of this photo is a recent landslide. And here's a video of one that occurred in 2017. And here is, so that last one would happen in 2017. Sorry, I was cut off. And this one just occurred 2 days ago.
Oh my gosh.
And most buildings are 8 stories or higher. And in building these, many times they cut into the foundations of the buildings above. The city is located in a very high earthquake hazard zone, and earthquakes can trigger simultaneous landslides on a much grander scale. So we decided to tackle these issues and started by asking ourselves, what would happen if an earthquake would occur? What would be the impact to this city? You could take a moment and think that for yourself. And so we worked precisely to answer this question by creating an earthquake scenario. We selected a scenario that was moderate and so not the worst case. The parameters of the scenario, including the magnitude, the depth, and the epicenter location, were selected based on the known seismicity and the characteristics of the area. We worked with the US Geological Survey, USGS, who provided a shake map, which is what you see here. This estimates the shaking intensity for the given scenario, which is indicated by the different colors. So in the Aizawl area, you can see that the shaking would be perceived as very strong to severe in orange to red color there. We then estimated the impacts from this particular scenario. We based this on the known vulnerabilities of the built environment and the slopes, and equations that basically provide building collapse probabilities and the resulting casualties. Our findings indicated that hundreds to over 1,000 landslides would be triggered from this event. There would be over 14,000 buildings collapsed. There would be 25 to 31 fatalities, depending on whether it's monsoon season, and there would be major damage to utilities and infrastructure. These are very shocking, but we know from experience that simply sharing numbers and data is typically insufficient to motivate action. So beyond forecast calculations, we personalize our scenarios. And to give you an example, I want to read you an abridged excerpt from the Aizawl scenario. Picture what may happen to you in this scenario. And as you do this, imagine living the scenario and ask yourself, where will I be? Where will my children be? Where will my partner and my parents be? What are my responsibilities to them? And will I be able to care for them? It is 2 p.m. on a weekday when a magnitude 7.0 earthquake strikes Aizawl. Centered on a fault 10 kilometers northwest of Aizawl and 30 kilometers deep, the earthquake is not the largest that could happen, but it is large enough to do tremendous damage. The shaking lasts about 30 seconds. In that brief period of time, it changes Aizawl forever. The shaking collapses thousands of buildings, sends hundreds of landslides thundering down slopes, and throws brick walls, water tanks, and pieces of buildings down onto streets and paths. The noise is deafening. Where can you find safety? Everything is moving, everything is falling. Fortunately, your building remains standing, but many do not. When the shaking stops, a thick, choking cloud of dust created by the collapsed buildings rises over the city. More than 19,000 Aizawl residents have been killed immediately. You have made choices about the safety of your home or workplace that have helped you survive. Your house was designed and built to resist earthquakes. Your home is not in a zone of very high landslide hazard, and you have taken care not to destabilize the slope. As the dust begins to clear, you emerge from your home or workplace to a changed city. Debris from more than 14,000 collapsed buildings block streets and paths. Older reinforced concrete buildings constructed before building regulations went into effect have collapsed and killed the most people. Some buildings have fallen downhill and caused those below to fall as well. Landslides triggered by the earthquake have severed roads and water mains and have swept away electrical poles. There is no power, no water, and no mobile phone service. Although you don't know it yet, most of Aizawl's communications and transportation links with the rest of India and the world are completely cut off. Your elderly neighbor is seriously injured, and you and a family member decide to take her to the hospital. After an arduous 3-hour journey on foot around piled debris and crushed cars, you finally reach the hospital, only to find chaos. Although the main building still stands, the interior of the hospital is badly damaged, and people are crammed into the parking area outside. Doctors and nurses are trying to treat the injured with whatever supplies and equipment they could pull out of the hospital, but supplies are completely inadequate for the number injured. Nurses are dividing patients into 3 categories. First, those who will not be treated because their injuries, although painful, are not severe. Second, those who will not be treated because their injury is so severe that they will die regardless. And third, those who will be treated as help becomes available. These decisions are difficult and upsetting to all involved. Family members of those not treated find it hard to accept these decisions, and police must move them away so nurses can continue to work. Many do not survive. 6,000 more people will die from a lack of timely medical care, bringing the total number of deaths to more than 25,000. It is now dark, and the journey home is completely impossible without light, so you sleep outside the hospital in the only empty space you can find. In the meantime, your spouse has made a similarly difficult journey to your children's school, as planned in your family's preparedness plan. There is chaos outside as parents try to find their children. The government school building, designed by an engineer and built to resist earthquakes, withstood the shaking without collapsing. Long before the earthquake, the teachers prepared and trained students on what to do. Because the engineer, the builder, and the teachers chose to prepare for an earthquake, your children survived, and your spouse finds them frightened but safe. In the days that follow the earthquake, the situation becomes increasingly dire. Food and cooking gas began to run out. Helicopters, the only way in and out of the city, are busy bringing rescuers in and taking the badly injured out. You have a family emergency kit with stored water and food, which helps somewhat. You and your family, finally reunited, help neighbors in any way that you can. But if more aid does not arrive soon, your children will not have enough to eat. You begin to consider how you and your family might leave the city and return on foot to your parents' home village. But due to the lack of communication, you do not know whether that village also suffered damage. Because of badly damaged and collapsed buildings, more than half of the city's residents do not have a safe place to live. It takes months just to clear the debris. Recovery will be so long and painful that the majority of residents will leave over the course of the coming weeks and months. Aizawl will never be the same. This paints a different picture than just the numbers, right? Now I want to read you an excerpt from the section that follows, titled Aizawl's Choice.
Veronica, may I invite you to turn your camera back on?
I don't have that option.
Okay, sorry, continue.
But sure. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Today, Aizawl stands on the threshold of major growth with a master plan that sees the population doubling in the next 20 years. The choice the Aizawl community faces is a serious one. Your city can choose to build safely, to avoid destabilizing the land, and to reduce the risk presented in this scenario. Or it can let development proceed with building practices that increase risk. If Aizawl makes only marginal improvements, your capital city will face devastation when a major earthquake strikes. We urge you to choose for the future and invest now in a safe, thriving city. So the real action actually starts after the scenario is developed, right? Because this is to help inform activities and actions that can be taken to reduce risk. So following the development of the scenario, we worked very closely with local leaders and partners and experts to develop locally appropriate recommendations for actions that can be taken in the immediate, midterm, and long term. So our progress to date has been that we've developed the landslide hazard map detailed enough to inform development. We have trained local geologists and officials to assess landslide risk. We formed a landslide policy committee to improve policies that address landslides. And this committee developed the roadmap to stability, which is basically an action plan outlining the different actions and who's responsible and over what timeline they would be implemented. And this helped move forward the site development and slope modification regulations that were put in place in 2017. These regulations serve to regulate construction or other activity that can destabilize slopes. For this work, Aizawl has been considered a model city. It was recognized by the Indian National Disaster Management Authority as an example to follow. It's the first in India to have such detailed landslide hazard maps that can inform development. First to hire geologists on the municipal government to help guide safe development. And it's the first to create and implement an action plan for landslide risk mitigation. Now, there's still a lot of work to do in Aizawl, and we continue working there, but Aizawl is on a much better track for safer development and for a safer future. So my main takeaway, I think, from this particular example is that scenarios can be an incredibly powerful tool for motivating action, but in particular when they're done in close collaboration with local partners and leaders. So I want to give the last example of a recent program before I get into the concepts. And this one is one that started a few years back in the country of Bhutan. This is on earthquake desks. So most of Bhutan's 600 schools are located in a high seismic zones, as you can see here from this map indicated in orange to reddish colors. The schools themselves are indicated by the different colored circles, triangles, and diamond that you see on the map. And as you can see, a lot of the schools are of rubble masonry or stone masonry. This is unreinforced masonry, and this type of construction is very heavy and brittle and is very vulnerable to collapse under earthquake shaking. Now, Bhutan, like most countries, practice drop, cover, and hold. A safety practice that's practiced in schools for school children to do during earthquake shaking. So they get under their desk and they hold on while you have there's earthquake shaking going on. But what we find is that in very heavy construction that's vulnerable to collapse, this gives some false sense of safety. This is an example of a school classroom from the 2015 Nepal earthquake. And what you see at the forefront, those sticks that you see, are the remnants of a school desk. So ideally, all vulnerable schools would be replaced or strengthened, and the government of Bhutan is working on this and making progress on this. But to address all vulnerable schools, it will take a lot of resources in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, and it will take many decades. But an earthquake can happen anytime, and many students face this risk today. So next, I want to show you a video about an interim solution that was applied in Bhutan to address this issue.
Earthquakes can cause widespread destruction and loss. Developing countries are hardest hit, mainly because weak buildings and infrastructure collapse on people during quakes. Worldwide, millions of children attend schools that would be unsafe in the event of an earthquake. One effective way to deal with this threat is to prepare schools before earthquakes occur. Located in the Himalayas, Bhutan is in a high-risk seismic zone and is no stranger to earthquakes. The two moderate earthquakes of 2009 and 2011 resulted in damages to more than 150 schools in Bhutan. Moderate earthquake events experienced by Bhutan and the recent magnitude 7.9 Nepal earthquake are indicative of what would happen in terms of death, injury, and destruction of property should a large earthquake occur with its epicenter located within or close to the country.
The best way to protect school kids during earthquakes is to build safe schools. Unfortunately, many of Bhutan's schools, particularly the oldest ones, were not built to resist earthquakes. Walls and ceilings will collapse. Bhutan is planning to build safe schools, but this is going to take money and time, and an earthquake can happen any day. A strong desk, which we call an earthquake desk, can offer protection for kids right away.
Schools are among the most vulnerable, and Bhutan's Ministry of Education has been trying to make schools safer. GeoHazards International, GHI, has been collaborating with the ministry and most recently introduced the unique earthquake desk with the plan to teach Bhutanese furniture manufacturers to make the desks locally. The earthquake desk was invented by Ido Bruno and Arthur Bruter of the Bezalel Academy in Jerusalem, Israel.
One of the pictures really caught my eye was a classroom collapsed totally on the children, and they were all crushed under the desks.
Unlike common school desks, the earthquake protective desk is designed as a life-saving device under which children can seek shelter during an earthquake. Ido and Arthur traveled to Bhutan in January 2016 to train 5 local furniture manufacturing firms in a week-long program facilitated by the Ministry of Education and GeoHazards International with support from AIR Worldwide, a risk analytics company. Within a span of 1 week, local manufacturers and their welders and carpenters were not only able to understand the importance and value of the earthquake school desk as a life safety device for school children, but also worked together to produce the first 14 locally manufactured earthquake desks in Bhutan.
And hopefully there will be found the right budget for this, because these tables, of course, they're not only tables, they're also safety equipment. So they cost more than a standard table, but they also give you more than a standard table.
The week-long training ended with impact tests carried out in the presence of representatives from the Ministry of Education, schools, armed forces, and local media. The excited crowd witnessed firsthand how a standard school desk crumbled to pieces under a 356-kilogram load. While in the second test, the locally manufactured earthquake desk withstood a far greater load of 422 kilograms. This pilot project is an example of successful collaboration between various partners, the government, an NGO, private companies, and the right academic and technical experts.
I feel while we don't have much money to actually retrofit the school buildings or construct new schools, the cheapest and economical way of saving lives of our school children would be to have these type of school desks.
The earthquake protective desks produced in Bhutan are a visible reminder of the earthquake risk in Bhutan and the need to prepare. It is also a symbol of positive collaboration and joint aspiration of all partners in this endeavor to reduce risks and minimize loss of lives during earthquakes.
Maybe in, I think, 3 years' time, 4 years' time, we could be really proud and say that we remember that time so many years ago when we made the first earthquake table in Bhutan. Remember that time? Look, now every school has them. They're all over the place. Bhutan's children are protected.
So since this video was shot, 200 earthquake deaths have been locally manufactured and placed in high-risk schools. There's 3 local manufacturers that have been approved by the Ministry of Education to produce these tests and are now able to provide these additional earthquake tests for more schools. And we are now also starting a feasibility study to see if this is also a feasible solution for neighboring country, Nepal. Okay, so I will now move on to the first example of a concept that is under development. This is a concept that was actually developed for an Indonesian city, and then we're now looking to apply in Haiti. And this is of a tsunami evacuation park. So here we have the 2 countries that I'll be talking to you about. And at first sight, they may seem like there's nothing in common, but I want to walk you through some of the similarities that we find in the city of Padang, West Sumatra, Indonesia, where this concept was initially formed, and that of northern Haiti and Cap Haitian. So first off, I want to talk to you about their tectonic settings and how they're similar. Here we see the island of West Sumatra in Indonesia, and we see Padang here. We see that it has 2 faults that are close to it. We have the Sunda Trench, which is offshore in the Sumatra Fault. Now the fault offshore is a thrust fault, which generates vertical movement. And because it generates vertical movement, this creates the largest tsunamis. And then we have a strike slip fault. And in the particular case of West Sumatra, it is inland, so it does not generate tsunamis. Now let's go to Haiti. So here we have Haiti, and we have Cap Haitian here in the north. And again, we have 2 faults indicated in yellow. Offshore, we have the Hispaniola Trench, which is also a thrust fault generating vertical movement, which would generate tsunamis. And we have a strike slip fault close to the city of Cap Haitian. Now, in this particular case, the strike slip fault is actually offshore Cap Haitian, meaning that that one could generate a smaller tsunami from that of Hispaniola Trench, but it would arrive at the shore much faster. Now, the last time each of these cities had a tsunami generated event was about 200 years ago. And in the case of Cap Haitian, that event killed half the population of the city at that time. Now, when we look at the tsunami inundation models, we see that in both cases, we can expect several kilometers of inundation. And in the case of Cap Haitian, which is here on the right, this covers, if you can see here, this covers the entire runway of the only international airport, or only airport in Cap Haitian. So this is particularly troublesome for Cap Haitian because following a tsunami, you need to be able to fly in and out for relief efforts. Now, both cities are very flat. They have very flat terrain with no quick access to high ground. As you can see, the hills are pretty far back. There's a few kilometers inland. So ideally, during a tsunami, people evacuate inland or to high ground. But as you can see here, that is not an option. Both cities have a very exposed population. They are very densely populated, with most living along the coast at less than 5 meters above sea level. Padang, Indonesia in particular, has a population of 900,000 people, and they have about 20 to 25 minutes to evacuate. What does this mean? This means that once the earthquake is generated, so the people in Padang would feel earthquake shaking, they have about 20 to 25 minutes before the first tsunami wave arrives at the shore. Now, in the case of Cap Haitian, a city of 275 people that is growing very rapidly, they only have 10 to 15 minutes to evacuate. So the question is, how do you evacuate hundreds of thousands of people within 10 to 25 minutes? And this is the question that we pose to ourselves. In the case of Padang, we're looking at 20 to 25. In the case of Cap Haitian, 10 to 15 minutes. And what we saw in the case of Indonesia when we were doing this project about 10 years ago is that there were some serious evacuation issues during past earthquakes. Here you see examples from the 2007 earthquake and the 2009 earthquake. Fortunately, neither of these earthquakes generated a tsunami, but the population did not know it at the time. So everyone was trying to evacuate at the same time. You can see the traffic jam that was created, and it was almost impossible for many to get to safe ground. So we took a look at the particular situation in Padang, and we developed recommendations to improve their evacuation capacity. So recommendations included things like improving evacuation routes by either widening roads that go inland, or also providing bridges in the cases where there was high ground nearby. And this is only in a couple of spots in the city where there is limited high ground available that was only not accessible by a pretty narrow river, for example. New development can also occur outside the tsunami zone. So that's another way to think about it in the long term, how to reduce this risk. And we also looked at what we call vertical evacuation structures. So if you can't get out of the tsunami inundation area, you can develop or construct structures that help you go above the inundation. So just to give you an example of some of these concepts, there's things like tsunami evacuation buildings that are specifically designed to first resist the earthquake that generates the tsunami, and then to be higher than the expected inundation at that particular site. We also looked at what we called tsunami decks, which the idea was that we could make use of pedestrian overpasses as kind of a last minute resort. So if people are stuck in traffic trying to escape and the wave is coming and there's nowhere else to go, this would be a place where people can go as last resort. And a tsunami evacuation park, which would serve as a park from day to day, and could also serve as an evacuation refuge area during a tsunami. So this kind of an artificial berm is the concept here. So interestingly enough, when we were developing a lot of these concepts, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami occurred, and actually we were working a lot with Japanese colleagues on developing some of these concepts. And what we saw was that some of these concepts were tested in the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. So I just want to give you some examples so you get a sense of what those were. So first, here we just have a tsunami evacuation building. This building in particular saved over 300 people. Here we have a photo of a a pedestrian overpass or bridge that was used kind of in the way that we had been envisioning with the tsunami deck, where people were stuck in traffic and couldn't get inland fast enough, and the wave started coming. So people left their cars on the streets and went up and saved their lives. So I believe this pedestrian bridge saved something like 100 people. And artificial hills or berms. Here you see an example of one in particular. The photo on the left is a photo after the event, so you get a kind of a sense of what it looks like. And on the right is just a snapshot of a video that someone took during the tsunami. And in the background, you can see the tsunami wave coming in. So we were particularly interested in the artificial berm in terms of for Haiti, as we think it would be a locally appropriate solution to consider for Cap Haitian. And actually, Japan has started building more of these evacuation hills. This particular example is of Millennium Hope Hills that have been built in Japan following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. So 15 of these have been built to serve as tsunami evacuation centers, but also in memory of those who lost their lives in the 2011 event. So here's just a close-up of the concept that we had originally developed for Padang. And this is only a concept. I think the exact height required is very location sensitive, and this is really important as it needs to be substantially higher than the expected tsunami inundation depth at the site location. So you can expect for a tsunami park that's closer to the shore to be higher than one that would be maybe a little bit further inland, but still within the inundation zone. And here's another angle of the tsunami park concept. One of the things we really liked about the tsunami park is that it's accessible 24 hours. One of the lessons learned from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake was that many of the evacuation structures that were used to save people's lives wouldn't have necessarily been accessible had the event occurred at a different time of day. So the event occurred during the day and people were able to access them, but many of these structures they're not necessarily open 24 hours and are not accessible at all times. So this is a very important aspect of when thinking about vertical evacuation for an entire community. So this idea is still in development, but these are some potential sites that we have identified for an evacuation park. And we hope that with substantial technical and funding support, we can move this idea forward. Now, the last concept I want to share with you is an idea of a program that we have not yet applied. And this is of climate futurescapes. And this is a new method to motivate climate change adaptation at the city level. Although in many ways, this is not a new method as it borrows concepts and aspects of our past programs, and in particular, those that we have found to really work in motivating action related to earthquake, landslide, and tsunami risks, but now we're trying to apply them to climate-related hazards. And for this work, we would be partnering with Woodwell Climate Research Center, that's formerly known as Woods Hole Research Center, and this is a leading organization in climate change and its impacts. Now, we're seeing that leading scientists are developing increasingly precise models to forecast climate change and its impacts. But many projections are too large a scale to be meaningful to local leaders. And forecasts, although very scientifically rigorous, are not understandable to the lay public or presented in a way that is actionable. So this makes the problem feel complex and overwhelming and inhibits action. So our proposed process is to first create a team of key local stakeholders and experts that would provide key insights and expertise. Now, this group would be engaged throughout the entire process. We would then characterize likely impacts based on climate change projections and their corresponding changes in rainfall, in temperature, and sea level rise, etc. And the likely impacts would also consider how the city may change and grow and develop over the next 30 to 40 years. We would then co-develop potential adaptation and mitigation measures and develop recommendations based on which measures seem to be the most effective and feasible. Next, we would create 2 Futurescapes stories and share widely with the community. So these 2 stories would be 30 to 40 years into the future. One story would assume that no adaptation measures were put into place, and the other would assume that adaptations were implemented. And so the intent is to show the difference between these 2 futures. And ultimately, all this work would inform the city's climate adaptation plan, with the goal of having a plan that is locally championed and supported by the community. We intend to first apply this in one pilot city, with the latest candidate for that being in southern India in the city of Trivandrum. But the overall goal is to start with a pilot city, improve the process, and then apply it to other cities. Before I wrap up, I wanted to highlight some of the key tenets of the way that we work, some of which you've already heard throughout my presentation. And the first is that we take action before disasters, as we know that this is the most effective way to save lives and protect communities, is to start preparing before a disaster strikes. Second is we connect leaders with expertise. And this is target expertise, particular to the issues and challenges that that particular community is facing. So we don't bring in cookie cutter solutions. We really try to focus on what would work for this particular community. Third, we advance local capabilities, as we know that solutions endure when the community members have the capacity to assess their own risk and to solve problems. We consider the social context, as we know that disasters and barriers to change are not the same for everyone. We communicate and inspire, as we know that long-term solutions are never purely technical. And to motivate action, we develop information that is clear, relevant to daily life, and actionable. And last, we cultivate trust, as relationship of trust enable steady progress, and risk reduction is a process that takes time. Okay, now for key takeaways. First is that growing risk is far outpacing our efforts to mitigate it. This includes things like new and exacerbated hazards due to climate change, exposed population and built environment in very high hazard areas, and rapid development and growth that is not risk informed or engineered. And because this risk is going at such an alarming rate, it needs to be treated with urgency. Second is we need to better understand and address cascading and concurrent disasters. It's no longer adequate to just focus on one hazard or with multiple hazards happening at different times. Climate change is likely to bring on disasters that overlap, trigger, and amplify each other. And most work in disaster risk reduction and preparedness does not account for this. We continue to see an underinvestment in proactive preventative measures, and this really needs to change if we ever hope to keep up with this growing risk. And disaster impacts are unequal. The poorest suffer the most, and we're seeing this now with the pandemic. Next, the scenarios can be a very powerful tool for generating locally led action, but it is critical that they are communicated in a way that feels relevant to the target community. And this leads to my next takeaway, which is that scientific and engineering projections and models are not enough to motivate action. Making conclusions understandable and translating the findings to locally relevant, actionable information is critical. Next is building resilience is a long-term effort. There is no quick fix for this. Strong local engagement is critical to ensuring lasting impact. And this is because no one is better placed to speak on whether a certain solution or a process is feasible than local people themselves. And for impact to last, it needs to be locally championed. Similarly, strengthening and investing in local professionals and advocates is very effective as they're committed to their communities and will be there long after any project is over. Engaged youth, they are the future of their communities and often make up a large portion of the population. So I put Haiti here in particular because in Haiti, something like 45% of the population is under the age of 20. Preventative measures can take many years to show their benefits, and in the case of Nepal, it took 20 years. This is something to keep in mind as we invest in preventative proactive measures. Much of the infrastructure in emerging communities is yet to be built. This presents a tremendous opportunity as it's much easier to and less expensive to build and develop safely from the beginning as opposed to coming in afterwards and trying to reduce vulnerability. There's a particularly urgent need in communities that are growing now. So there's already making decisions around design, construction, planning, and siting. And relatively simple decisions like where to build the next road and where to place the next hospital or emergency center can encourage a development in safer areas and prevent future catastrophes. Every community is unique, but we can learn from each other. So as you saw from the examples from the tsunami park, there was a lot of similarities between Haiti and Indonesia, but not just those two, with Japan as well. We're taking a lot of lessons that have been learned from Japan. So there's a lot for us to learn from each other. And there's also communities just face similar challenges. So in the case of remote towns in the Himalayas, they face a risk of isolation during disasters, but so do small island nations that also face the risk of being completely isolated during and after a disaster. And so I've said a lot today, and if you only take one thing away, I want it to be that, and this is particularly for the students, that the world needs smart people like you to take on these complex problems. These are not easy issues to take on. There's no easy solution, and they take many years. And I just think that if we have more and more smart people and dedicated people working on these issues, it would be very beneficial to all of society. So with that, I'd like to thank our corporate partners who make a lot of this work possible. And also on behalf of the entire GeoHazards International team, I'd like to say thank you. The people you see here are a big reason that the programs I just talked about were put in place. They're the ones really leading a lot of the work. I'd also like to say thank you to our technical partners, to foundations, to individual donors, and to everyone listening in today. If you have any thoughts or comments that we don't get to today, feel free to send an email and you can visit our website here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Veronica, before we continue, it appears we have a slight technical issue with your webcam. So I've been instructed to ask you to sign off and sign back on if that's possible. And then we'll continue with the response in about 30 seconds.
Great, I will do that now. Thank you.
is thinking that we're so grateful for her incredibly informative and interesting and important talk. And I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure all of us did as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, we'll have a discussion. And as I introduced in the beginning, our discussion will be joined by panelist Daniele Stabek Rodriguez, who is an alumna of our Master of Architecture program and is also working in the area of resilience and disaster relief. Veronica, it looks like you're back, which is fabulous. We can see you, wonderful. Excellent. So thank you to those who have been posting questions in the Facebook and webcast features. Please continue to post your questions. We're collating them live and we'll get to many of them over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. I wanted to begin before we go into the audience questions with a few of my own and engage Daniele a little bit. So perhaps I'll begin by asking Daniele if she would like to give a response to the wonderful lecture from Veronica Cedillos.
Hi, Caitlin. Thank you so much. First, thank you for the invitation, and it's always great to be back. So thank you very much, and thank you, Veronica, for this amazing lecture. I think we're going to have a great discussion. I really felt connected with a lot of the things that you were talking about, describing the thought process, the concerns. So I hope we flesh those out. But I just wanted to say in general that it's great to see these scenarios and these examples and these case studies. I think the world of disaster resilience and response is full of a lot of confusion and speculation. Nobody really knows what to do and things happen. And it's so wonderful to see these examples. And you just showed a variety of very holistic solutions and a wide scope from the desks, school desks, to scenarios and modeling to actually teaching people about construction. So that, to me, reinforces that we can think broadly about how to tackle this problem. And it's very, very relevant and very important to think right now. Some people watching this lecture might think that these places are far away and disconnected from us, but disaster is becoming normal, or the new normal, right? And it's really coming close to home because of multiple factors. So as designers, we need to start really, really thinking about how to incorporate these topics into our education, into our interests, but also how, this is perhaps an open question, how do we as designers and professionals involve ourselves as individuals beyond school, beyond participating in GHI? How do we get on the mindset of doing and participating in creating coalitions, interdisciplinary coalitions? So I think that's a mixture of a response and a couple of questions, but yeah, I really appreciate the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniele. Veronica, you're welcome to answer directly, or I can ask a few more questions, but do you have any thoughts in terms of Daniele's question of sort of what one can do at an individual level and how one builds these coalitions?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking in the university case in particular, I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration between different universities. That's one of the things that we did when we were working on the tsunami evacuation concepts. We had a partnership, I didn't get to talk about this, but we had a partnership with between Stanford University and Andalus University, which is a local university in Padang. And that was very enriching for students on both ends. And to this day, I still get emails sometimes from former students from that program saying how much it influenced their work and perspective of how important their work is. So I think from the university, this is very particular to university, but from the university level, seeking those type of collaboration for students so they have that that perspective from the get-go is very valuable.
Since we're on the topic of students and universities, I see there have been a number of questions, and I'm not surprised that these have come up from people asking about what one can study or how one who is studying architecture and or engineering can get involved in this type of work. And I think it's an important and interesting question because on the one hand, students from places like MIT or Stanford or these other universities you've worked with have really high grade technical and architectural skills that are of value and use internationally, and this kind of talent can be put to really great use. On the other hand, of course, we don't want to we worry about applying things a little bit too heavy-handedly or not really understanding the context in which we're working. And there's a danger of someone from a university like MIT thinking, I know everything about this problem. I have all the technical expertise. I'm gonna arrive in this location and solve everyone's problems. And that obviously there are a lot of things to be worried about in that scenario. So what advice would you give to students in general, and how does one strike that balance?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think it's really critical. I mean, one of my last points of the key tenets of how we work is cultivating trust. So I don't think it's something that happens overnight. So I think, having people on the ground that are facilitating that connection is really important. Because even students on the other, even if you had a connection with the university, those students in that other country might also not fully understand all the factors that play into what drives community decisions. And so having someone facilitate that process is absolutely key. And you need to have very strong collaboration with local partners. And it's not just at the end where you say, hey, give me your input. What do you think? Review this final product. It's even in developing the ideas and even like brainstorming, designing the process. They need to be involved because you might miss something so important that it's just not obvious to you, and that is obvious to someone else who's living that reality.
Totally, and I think that's such a true point for all types of collaborations, that it really requires trust. It's a long-term thing, and ideally, you start speaking as early as possible in the process. I might follow up with a technical question, since technically this is a part of this lecture is related to building technology where I sit. And Veronica, you and I are both structural engineers, and Danielle, you are an architect in training, but also have done quite a lot with structures. And one of the things I think is especially interesting and confounding about seismic resistant design is that it can be quite unintuitive compared to conventional structural engineering for daily service loads that we're used to and that we kind of see regularly. And so a lot of people have a good physical intuition for how a building or a structure might perform under gravity loads, for example, or even under wind loads. But a seismic event is so rare, and we have so little, most of us have so little firsthand experience with it, that it can be very hard, not only for the future occupants of the building to understand the seismic resistance strategies, but even for students and architects and engineers to really internalize these principles. And one that you mentioned quite a lot was mass. I think a lot of people associate mass with strength and with stability and safety, but in fact, in a seismic event, mass can be incredibly deadly. And then I guess to counter that, another interesting point is in other types of disasters, mass can be helpful. So in a hurricane, a lot of people associate having a heavy concrete roof with being safe because unlike a lightweight timber roof, it's less likely to detach and wind uplift from the walls or from the foundations. And so that can create understandable biases among people where they prefer one type of construction to another that isn't necessarily the safest for the types of disasters that are anticipated. So yeah, how do you deal with that? And maybe I'll ask first Veronica and then Danielle.
That's an excellent point. And maybe, yeah, so you need to think holistically when you work in somewhere. You can't just focus on earthquakes or hurricanes, or else you might be setting up the place to be more vulnerable to another hazard, right? So interestingly enough, like some of the most vulnerable structures to earthquakes in the Port-au-Prince earthquake, they're great for hurricanes, right? Because they're heavy mass and exactly as you said, but it was the opposite it's basically opposite for earthquake and tsunamis. And we've seen in other events where some houses or structures are elevated for flooding, purposes, but that creates basically a structure on stilts, which is very vulnerable to earthquakes. So taking I think what we have found over the years that you have to consider all the relevant hazards for that particular region. And as another reason that we're starting to really look into what are the new and exacerbated hazards that we're finding from climate change, because by ignoring some of them and only focusing on earthquakes per se, you can create more vulnerability.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Daniele, do you want to add anything based on your experience in Puerto Rico?
Sure, thank you. It definitely comes down to the hazard, vulnerability, exposure triad that Veronica was talking about before, and you kind of learn about these things through experience. I think it's perhaps counterintuitive when you're trying to design to focus on so many variables at the same time. I think we tend to decide if it's going to be hurricane, if it's going to be earthquake, if it's going to be flooding. And it's about, or now it's becoming about multi-risk design. In Puerto Rico, we had this experience with Hurricane Maria 3 years ago. And we lost a lot of roofs and we lost a lot of shelter because the primary building method for the roofing was wood, but it was badly built, which was the actual problem. And we had a lot of concrete roofs that resisted the hurricane. But this past year, we had earthquakes for the first time in 100 years. And a lot of these structures that we thought were very robust and people collectively felt safer in these concrete structures. Most of them were the most dangerous ones and they collapsed, including schools and including houses. And it was the wooden structures that behaved the best. So it really is about understanding all of these risks and having all the disciplines at the table and stressing that it doesn't matter which method you end up using, the construction techniques need to be up to the standard, up to code.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at some of the questions we've received from the audience, and I think, Veronica, because you were so clear about your work, a lot of the questions are expanding the scope beyond and asking you what's next and how do we do more, which is wonderful, and I think a testament to the excellence of your work. One question asks about funding and financial support for this type of work, and it says, there's a sense that there's more funding available for response than prevention. And so the question is, what is the factor that is leading to that? And what can we do about it?
Well, I mean, I think, there's just this sense of urgency when you have an event, right? Which is very, very hard to create when you're doing preventative work. You're saying, in the case of far West Nepal, we've been working far West Nepal, in an earthquake that hasn't had an earthquake in an area hasn't had an earthquake in over 500 years. So, and they have a very high risk because it hasn't happened in 500 years. There's been a lot of tension building up, and we know it's urgent, but feeling urgency around that or communicating the urgency around that is incredibly difficult. Now, if an event happens, that's very different. People feel the urgency, they see it. And it's also kind of going back to what I was talking about, when you see the benefit of the proactive measure, right? So we retrofitted the school in Nepal, in Kathmandu Valley, and then there was no visual benefit of it, right? For many, many years until 20 years later, now we see this just impressive benefit from that. So it's on the side of like creating the urgency that makes it very difficult, but also like showing what the impact has been from preventative measures. That is very difficult because our goal is for nothing to happen, right? Nothing happened to the school. So that's the impact as opposed to it collapsing. So it is much more difficult to measure. In terms of funding sources, so yeah, we receive funding sources from international organizations, agencies that fund this type of work. That's a significant portion of our funding, so like UN, World Bank, but also from foundations and individual donations. So we have a lot of people who are very supportive of our work and who have been for many years. And so that's another big chunk of our of what funds our work.
Excellent. Daniele, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I would say that definitely all of this resonates a lot. The funding question is a very difficult one, not only for post-disaster work, or I should say, if it's difficult for post-disaster work, it's even harder for preventative work. Something that where I would love to learn more about, right, is how you engage international help, how you engage other communities, how you put pressure on these things. And it's a wide topic. Speaking specifically of the US, there are FEMA mitigation grants, for example, which are something that I just recently became aware of, that are trying to do that. They're about mitigation and creating safe rooms and safe shelters for communities that communities apply for. So I guess that's one interesting example.
Another question asks about climate change, and I think, Veronica, you very clearly highlighted that the urgent climate change crisis is only exacerbating disasters, especially in vulnerable communities, often disconnected from the sources of climate change. As you said, there's an unequal experience of climate change and its effects, disproportionate to those who are causing it. This question asks, because climate change is exacerbating these disasters, at what point is prevention ineffectual, and what are the alternatives? So I would imagine, things like, moving cities is the idea that behind this question. What's your perspective on that?
That's a really hard question. And I think a point we don't want to get to, but I think it's a point we might face if we don't make preventative proactive work a high priority. And that's kind of the whole point of, the urgency around it, because otherwise I think we will have to face very, very difficult decisions like that.
Right. Another question is related to our current disaster. Many of us are facing the global COVID pandemic. And the question is about what lessons of resilience from the work of GeoHazards International and Daniele, in your work, could be applied to the ways we address our current pandemic.
To me, scenarios are very powerful. And I think there's been some scenario work or projections that have been developed for the pandemic and that we have developed. And I think one of the things that we saw with the pandemic was that it was showcasing that scenario work which we had done in the past can be very effective in like getting people's attention and people seeing like, okay, if we take these measures, this is how many people will die. If we don't take these measures, this is how many people will die. And those but translating those studies to and communicating them in a way that are easy to digest and that are actionable, I think is one of the things that kind of, at least I've seen as similar to kind of the type of work that we do, where we create these, very fancy or kind of, more technical forecasts, but then we want to make sure that those are translated to be actionable information, something that's meaningful, and that someone feels like, okay, if I do this differently, or if I as a community leader do this differently, this is how it can affect my community.
Daniele, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin. In terms of the pandemic, it is definitely a disaster. It's a thing, a force that we are dealing with right now. I was very recently involved in discussions of how to create a shelter in the south of Puerto Rico. And this was kind of the perfect storm, right? A shelter for the hurricane season through COVID that could resist the pandemic, or that could respond to it, while most of the shelters that are used for hurricanes are usually schools. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these schools were damaged completely. So how do you conceptualize that? I think the models the scenarios that Veronica is mentioning are very helpful to conceptualize what needs to change and what needs to be challenged. And in this case, we were specifically dealing with space and with confinement, open spaces, families, groups of individuals, and so on, and flexibility always in that mixture. So it is possible. These are new things that we are dealing with, that we're grappling with, in combination with all the seismic design, with all the wind load design. But I think we can definitely, through dialogue and through a lot of discussion, can at least begin to tackle those things. They are being done. There are manuals already and prescriptive measures of how these things can and could be done. So,
excellent. There's another question that's kind of about expanding the scope of what Veronica presented, and again gets at the idea that there's an unequal or disproportionate experience of disasters. The same magnitude earthquake could happen in San Francisco and Nepal, and I think Veronica showed the outcome can be quite different and much more disastrous for communities in poverty. So this question asks, are there things beyond engineering that we can do to address this, and what can we do more directly to address the economic and systemic factors that are exacerbating these disasters? And Veronica, I understand that your mission is one that's driven by technology, but I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well, so we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I would say, so first of all, yes. And we actually, one of the kind of similar events, there was two similar events that actually was a big reason why GeoHazards International exists. And this is the earthquake that occurred in Armenia in the late 80s. And an earthquake that occurred, a Loma Prieta earthquake that occurred in 1989. And they both, and both of them, a similar number of people experienced the same intensity of shaking from the earthquake. And the number of casualties was 400 to 1. So 400 more people died in the Armenia earthquake versus in San Francisco. So, and this is just, that was the example that kind of, was a push for our founder, Dr. Brian Tucker, to create this organization. But there's been many examples in the past. You can look at the ones from Haiti and Chile, which happened in 2010, which were also very similar. And we saw a dramatic difference in the impacts. In terms of what we can do, to me, investing in local people is so important. It's a long-term thing. It's not going to be a quick fix, but it's also one that will last much longer than any quick fix. And that's because local people are local professionals, and local leaders and local advocates are committed to their communities. And so empowering them helps them become those leaders and those advocates for their communities. And they're going to be there after a specific project ends or a program ends or NGO leaves. So they are really the constant voice and leadership that is needed. So I really think that investing in the local leaders and youth is really what is needed for the future of these communities.
Thank you. Extremely powerful point. Daniele, would you like to add anything to that?
Of course, I couldn't agree more with what Veronica is saying right now. Beyond engineering, in these topics, there is a lot, and empowering local foundations and local leaders is very important, because they are going to stay with the project. They're going to be in the place, and they're definitely going to know how to administer help when it's needed. I've been recently working with a foundation that tries to incorporate not only engineers, but also mental health experts, which is a really important part of all of this disaster topic. There is the mental health component, there is the training component, that it does have to do with design and engineering, but it's more of a vocational thing. There's the illustrating making manuals, delivering information, attending workshops and seminars, and there's even counseling and taking individual families through the route of reconstruction or preparedness, and you do not necessarily need to be engaging in engineering or architecture specifically to do those things. It's more of a support system or network that is created. So I just wanted to add that.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Daniele. We're just about at the end of our session. I'll ask Veronica if she has any final remarks she'd like to give us before we close.
Nothing in particular, but just thank you. And I guess it's wonderful to be here. And also, Daniele, it was wonderful to be on the panel with you as well. And I guess I'll just stress my point again, the last point I made, which is, the problems I talked about and the journey I've taken is, what I've chosen. But I think there's so many really pressing issues in our world today. And I just really want to encourage the students to be brave about tackling them and taking them on head on, especially if you're interested in this kind of work. I don't think in many cases it's not a well-trodden path, and there's not like you do this and then you do that and then you do this. My journey has been very nonlinear. I'm really not knowing what's coming next, but I think that's one of the reasons it's been really interesting, and I've learned so much, and I just really love the work that I do. So I encourage students to be brave about their career paths and really think deeply about what they want to do with their work.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And thank you, Daniele, as well for joining the panel. We're so grateful to have had you with us today, and we learned very much from you and appreciate you sharing your work. We had more questions than we had time to answer, so I think if you'd like to ask Veronica questions offline, she included the email link earlier in her talk, so I think you can reach out to GHI if you're interested in learning more. And thank you again to both of you. Before we sign off, I just want to make a quick announcement about our next lecture. So we hope you'll join us for the next lecture in the MIT Architecture Lecture Series on Thursday, October 15th, for a presentation by historian of design and pandemics, Sarah Jensen-Carr, and a discussion with Michael Murphy of the Mass Design Group, who are collaborating on a COVID-focused studio at MIT this fall in our department. You can see the full list of upcoming lectures and events at architecture.mit.edu. So with that, we'll conclude. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and a special thank you to Daniele Sabac Rodriguez and Veronica Cedillos. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.